Before we begin, if you enjoy these law enforcement horror stories, please hit that like button and subscribe. Also, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, let's get into this story. I'll never forget the color of the light coming from beneath the ice. It wasn't the pale blue you'd expect from a February morning on a Minnesota lake. It was wrong, a sickly yellow-green that pulsed like a heartbeat, visible even through 3 feet of solid ice. Jim Kowalski's fishing hole was still open, steam rising from the dark water like breath. His tackle box sat beside it, perfectly organized. His thermos was still warm. But Jim was gone, and something down there in the frozen deep was watching us. My name is Thomas Morrison. Everyone calls me Tom. I've been the sheriff of St. Louis County, Minnesota for 22 years. The Iron Range is my home, has been my whole life. My grandfather was sheriff here before me, and his father before him. 3 generations of Morrisons keeping the peace in this forgotten corner of northern Minnesota, where the winters are brutal and the land remembers things people try to forget. February of 1984 was one of the coldest on record. We're talking -30, -40 degrees with the wind chill, the kind of cold that makes your lungs hurt when you breathe, the kind that can kill you in minutes if you're not prepared. Most sensible people stayed indoors, kept their fires burning, waited for spring. But this is Minnesota. We don't stop living just because it's cold. Ice fishing is a way of life up here. Always has been. The call came in at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning. My dispatcher, Betty Hansen, sounded worried, and Betty didn't worry easy. "Sheriff, we got a situation out on Vermilion Lake. Jim Kowalski never came home from ice fishing. His wife, Carol, found his truck at the public access still running, heater on full blast. She drove out there when he didn't come home by midnight. I knew Jim Kowalski. Everyone in Tower knew Jim. He was 53 years old, a retired miner from the old Sudan mine, been ice fishing on Vermilion Lake since he was a kid. The man knew that lake like the back of his hand. He wasn't the type to wander off or fall through thin ice. Something about this didn't sit right. I grabbed my heavy parka, the one with the sheriff's department patch on the shoulder, and headed out into the darkness. The sun wouldn't be up for another hour, and the thermometer on my office wall read -32 degrees. My deputy, Mike Carlson, met me at the station. Mike was 35, strong as an ox, 3rd-generation Finnish American. Good man. Steady. We took my Bronco out to the lake. The roads were treacherous, snow-packed and slippery. The wind was howling, creating whiteout conditions that made it hard to see more than 20 feet ahead. We passed through Tower, the little mining town where Jim lived. Population 800. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business. Lights were on in a few windows despite the early hour. People watching, waiting. News travels fast in small towns. The public access was about 3 miles south of town. We found Jim's truck just like Betty said. A 1978 Ford, engine still running, headlights cutting through the blowing snow. The driver's side door was closed but not locked. I pulled up beside it and killed my engine. Mike and I sat there for a moment, neither of us wanting to step out into that brutal cold. "You ready?" Mike asked, pulling his balaclava up over his face. "Ready as I'll ever be," I replied. We got out. The cold hit me like a physical force, stealing my breath. The wind was screaming across the frozen lake, picking up loose snow and hurling it at us. I walked over to Jim's truck and looked inside. His wallet was on the passenger seat. His glasses were folded neatly on the dashboard. Jim needed those glasses to see anything more than 5 feet away. He wouldn't have left them behind. Mike was already walking out onto the ice, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I followed, my boots crunching on the wind-scoured surface. The ice on Vermilion Lake was solid, at least 3 feet thick, safe as concrete, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that crawled up my spine with every step. We found his spot about 200 yards out. Jim had set up his ice house, a small wooden shanty on runners that you could drag across the ice. The door was closed. Mike reached it first and knocked. No answer. He pulled the door open and we both looked inside. Empty. A small propane heater was still running, keeping the interior warm. A folding chair sat beside the fishing hole, which was still open, dark water visible in the circle of ice. Jim's fishing rod was propped against the wall, lying in the water. Everything was neat, orderly, exactly the way Jim would have left it. Except Jim wasn't there. "Tom, look at this," Mike said, kneeling beside the fishing hole. I crouched down next to him. That's when I saw it. The light, it was coming from deep below the surface, a strange yellow-green glow that pulsed slowly, like something breathing. The water in the hole was perfectly still, no movement at all, which was odd. Usually you'd see some current, some ripple. This was like looking into a pool of dark glass. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered. "I don't know. Could be some kind of algae, bioluminescence. In February, under 3 feet of ice?" He had a point. I'd grown up on these lakes. I'd never seen anything like this. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small flashlight, shining it down into the hole. The beam barely penetrated the darkness. The water seemed to swallow the light. "We need to call this in," Mike said. "Get the dive team out here, in this cold. No divers going in water this temperature, it's near freezing down there. Then what do we do?" I sat back on my heels thinking. The rational part of my brain was screaming that there had to be a logical explanation. Jim had wandered off, gotten disoriented in the dark, maybe fallen through somewhere else. The light was just some natural phenomenon, but the other part of my brain, the part that remembered my grandfather's stories, wasn't so sure. My grandfather, Sheriff Jonas Morrison, had died when I was 15. But before he passed, he told me things. Stories about the Iron Range, about the old mining days, about things that happened in the deep places beneath the earth, things that didn't make it into the official reports. I'd always thought they were just stories, the kind old men tell to scare kids. Now I wasn't so certain. "Let's search the area," I said finally. "See if we can find any tracks, any sign of where he went." We spent the next hour combing the ice around Jim's fishing spot. The wind had scoured away most of the loose snow, making it hard to see any tracks. But Mike found something about 50 yards to the east. More fishing holes. 6 of them, arranged in a perfect circle, each one about 10 feet from the next. They were old holes, frozen over with a thin layer of ice, but you could still see the circular cuts. "Tom, look at this pattern," Mike said, his voice tight. I looked. He was right. The holes formed a perfect circle, and in the center of that circle was Jim's fishing spot. Someone had drilled these holes deliberately, arranged them in a specific pattern. But why? And when? I knelt down and brushed snow away from one of the frozen holes. The ice was clear enough that I could see down into it. And there, in the dark water below, was that same yellow-green light. Fainter than in Jim's hole, but definitely there. All 6 holes had it. "Mike, check the others," I said. He moved from hole to hole, kneeling at each one. "They all got it, Tom, every single one. What the hell is going on?" Before I could answer, we heard it. A sound coming from beneath the ice, low and deep, like machinery running far below. But there was no machinery out here, no boats, no equipment, nothing. The sound grew louder, resonating through the ice beneath our feet. I could feel it vibrating in my chest. "We need to get off this ice," Mike said, backing toward the shore. "Wait," I said, holding up my hand. The sound changed, becoming almost musical. Not mechanical at all, more like singing, if singing could be done by something that didn't have a human voice. The yellow-green light in the holes began to pulse faster, brighter, and then suddenly it went out. All of it. Complete darkness except for our flashlights. The ice beneath us groaned, a long creaking sound that made my stomach drop. But it wasn't cracking. It was solid. The sound was something else, something deeper. "Now we run," I said. We made it back to shore in record time, our boots pounding on the ice. We didn't stop until we reached the trucks. Mike was breathing hard, his face pale in the growing dawn light. I wasn't doing much better. My hands were shaking, and not from the cold. What was that, Tom? What the hell was that? I don't know, but we're going to find out. We drove back to Tower as the sun came up, turning the sky a pale gray. I dropped Mike off at the station and told him to start calling people. We needed a search party, needed to organize a proper grid search of the lake. But first, I needed to make a stop. The Tower Historical Society was in an old brick building on Main Street, right next to the Lutheran Church. The Society's curator, Margaret Sanderson, was already there when I arrived, even though it was barely 8 in the morning. Margaret was 76 years old, sharp as a tack, and knew more about Iron Range history than anyone alive. "Tom Morrison," she said as I walked in, stomping snow off my boots. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have, Margaret. I need to look at some old records. Specifically, anything related to Vermilion Lake. Missing persons, accidents, unusual events, going back as far as you've got." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Follow me." The archives were in the basement, a cramped room filled with filing cabinets and boxes of old newspapers. Margaret pulled out a large leather-bound book and laid it on the table. "Sheriff's reports," she said. "Going back to 1900, your great-grandfather's records." I opened the book and started reading. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. February 1904. 3 miners disappeared while ice fishing on Vermilion Lake. Their gear was found, but their bodies never were. The report described strange lights seen beneath the ice in the days leading up to the disappearances. My blood ran cold. I flipped forward. February 1944. 5 men missing on Vermilion Lake. Same circumstances. Fishing gear found, bodies missing, strange lights reported. The investigating officer was Sheriff Jonas Morrison, my grandfather. There was a note paperclipped to the report written in my grandfather's handwriting. The ice took them, just like it did in '04, just like it will do again. The cycle is 40 years. God help whoever is sheriff in 1984. I stared at those words. 1984. That was now. That was this year. "Margaret," I said slowly, "did my grandfather ever talk to you about this?" She nodded, her expression grim. "Once. He came to me in 1960, asking about the old mining records, specifically about the Sudan mine. He wanted to know if there were any tunnels that ran under Vermilion Lake. I told him there were rumors, but nothing official. The mine maps only show tunnels going down, not out horizontally. But the old Finnish miners, the ones who worked there in the 20s and 30s, they used to tell stories about finding natural caves deep underground, caves with water in them. Underground lakes. Underground lakes, I repeated, beneath Vermilion Lake. Margaret leaned forward. "Tom, there's something else. The Ojibwe have stories about Vermilion Lake, too. Old stories, going back centuries. They say there's something that lives in the deep places beneath the ice, something that sleeps for long periods but wakes up hungry. They had a name for it, but the word is lost now. The missionaries made them stop using the old language. I felt like the temperature in the room had dropped 20 degrees. Did my grandfather believe these stories? She nodded. By the end, yes. He spent his last years trying to find out what really happened in '44. but he died before he could finish his investigation. Heart attack. They found him at his desk with all these files spread out in front of him. She walked over to a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder. These are his notes. I kept them after he died, thought maybe someday someone would want to finish what he started. I think that someone is you. I took the folder. Inside were dozens of pages covered in my grandfather's neat handwriting. Maps of the lake, cross-referenced with old mine maps. Interviews with survivors from 1904, drawings of symbols found in the deep tunnels of the Sudan mine, and photographs. Old, yellowed photographs showing the same thing I'd seen that morning. The yellow-green light beneath the ice. The last page was a letter, addressed to whoever came after him. To the next Morrison sheriff. I read it, standing there in that cold basement, and with every word, my sense of dread grew deeper. If you're reading this, then it's happening again. The 40-year cycle. I don't know what it is that lives beneath Vermilion Lake, but I know it's real. I know it takes people. And I know that stopping it, if it can be stopped at all, requires going down into the deep places, into the old Sudan mine, level 27. There's a tunnel there that's not on any map. The old miners sealed it up after 1904, but I found it in 1944. I went down there. I saw things no man should see. I managed to seal it again, but I know it won't hold forever. When it wakes again in 1984, whoever is sheriff will have to face it. I'm sorry, Tom. I'm sorry I'm not there to help you, but you come from strong stock. The Morrisons have always protected this county. Don't let it take anyone else. Find the tunnel. Find what's down there. And for God's sake, don't go alone. I looked up at Margaret. The Sudan mine is closed. Has been since '62. There's still a maintenance entrance, she said quietly. The Minnesota Historical Society keeps it open for tours during the summer. But in winter, it's locked up tight. I can get a warrant. She shook her head. You won't need one. I volunteer there. I have keys. 2 hours later, Margaret, Mike, and I were standing at the entrance to the Sudan mine. The mine was located about 10 miles from Tower, carved into the side of a rocky hill. It had been one of the richest iron ore mines in Minnesota, operational from 1884 to 1962. At its deepest point, level 27, it went down 2,400 feet, half a mile into the earth. The entrance was a large steel door set into the hillside, locked with a heavy chain. Margaret produced a key ring and unlocked it. The door swung open with a rusty squeal, revealing a concrete tunnel lit by emergency lights. The elevator is about 100 yards in, she said. It still works. They use it for the tours. We walked into the tunnel, our footsteps echoing. The temperature rose as we went deeper. Down here, insulated by thousands of feet of rock, it stayed a constant 50 degrees year-round. After the brutal cold outside, it felt almost tropical. The elevator was an industrial cage, big enough to hold 20 people. Margaret operated the controls, and we began to descend, down and down, passing level markers as we went. Level 5, level 10, level 15. The elevator rattled and swayed, making me acutely aware of the weight of rock above us. When we reached level 27, the elevator jerked to a stop. Margaret opened the gate, and we stepped out into a vast chamber. The walls were rough-hewn rock, stained rust red from the iron ore. Old rail tracks ran along the floor, disappearing into dark tunnels that branched off in multiple directions. Margaret led us down the main tunnel, her flashlight beam dancing on the walls. We passed old mining equipment, rusted and forgotten. The air was thick and heavy, pressing down on us. After about 10 minutes of walking, Margaret stopped at what looked like a solid wall. She pointed to a spot near the floor where the rock looked different, newer than the surrounding stone. "There," she said, "that's where your grandfather sealed it." I knelt down and examined the wall. It was concrete poured into a gap in the natural rock. Someone had tried to make it look like part of the original mine wall, but once you knew what to look for, it was obvious. I ran my hand across it. The concrete was cold and slightly damp. "We'll need tools to break through this," Mike said. I stood up, brushing dust off my knees. "Margaret, is there any other way into this tunnel? Any other entrance?" She shook her head. "Not that I know of. But Tom, the old miners who worked down here, they found natural caves. Miles of them. If this tunnel connects to those caves, and those caves connect to the underground lake system, then there could be dozens of ways in. Which means whatever's down there has multiple access points," Mike said. "Great, just great." I pulled out the map my grandfather had drawn, comparing it to our current location. According to his notes, this sealed tunnel ran north for about a mile before connecting to a large cavern. From there, it was another half-mile to an underground lake. And that lake, if his measurements were correct, was directly beneath Vermilion Lake. "We're coming back tomorrow," I said, "with proper equipment and more people. This is bigger than I thought." We rode the elevator back up in silence. When we emerged into the cold afternoon air, I felt like I'd been holding my breath the entire time underground. The sun was already setting, the short winter day coming to an end. We had maybe an hour of daylight left. "I need to check in with the search party," I told Margaret. "See if they found anything." "They won't have," she said quietly. "Not if it's like the other times." She was right. When I got back to the station, Betty told me the search party had covered the entire south end of Vermilion Lake. They'd found nothing. No tracks, no blood, no sign of Jim Kowalski. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. Or into the ice, I thought. That night, I sat in my office reading and rereading my grandfather's notes. Outside, the wind howled, and the temperature dropped to -40. I thought about Jim Kowalski, about his wife Carol waiting at home for news. I thought about the 3 miners in 1904, the 5 men in 1944. I thought about the yellow-green light pulsing beneath the ice, and I thought about what my grandfather had written. "Don't go alone." I picked up the phone and dialed. It rang 4 times before someone answered. "Sheriff Morrison," said a gravelly voice. I wondered when you'd call. It was Henry Whitefeather, the eldest member of the Ojibwe community near Tower. He was 89 years old, a keeper of the old stories, a man who remembered things others had forgotten. "Henry," I said, "I need to talk to you about Vermilion Lake, about what's underneath it." There was a long pause. Then he said, "You've seen the light?" "Yes. And someone's gone missing." "Yes. Jim Kowalski." Another pause. "Come to my house tomorrow morning, Sheriff, early. There are things you need to know before you go down into the deep places. Things your grandfather learned too late." He hung up before I could respond. I sat there in the darkness, listening to the wind, and wondered what tomorrow would bring. Wondered if I was really ready to face whatever was waiting beneath the ice. Outside, the temperature continued to drop. And somewhere under Vermilion Lake, in the cold, dark water, something ancient stirred in its sleep. Hungry. Waiting. The cycle had begun again. Henry Whitefeather lived in a small cabin about 5 miles north of Tower, deep in the woods where the road turned to dirt, and the pine trees grew so thick they blocked out the sky. I arrived just after dawn, the thermometer in my Bronco reading -38 degrees. Smoke was rising from his chimney, a thin gray line against the pale winter sky. He was waiting on his porch when I pulled up, wrapped in a heavy blanket, his weathered face impassive. I killed the engine and got out, the cold hitting me like a hammer. Henry didn't move, just watched me approach with those dark eyes that seemed to see right through you. "You look like your grandfather," he said as I reached the porch. "Same worry lines, same weight on your shoulders. Come inside, Sheriff." The cold is no place for this conversation. His cabin was warm, heated by a wood stove that glowed red in the center of the single room. The walls were covered with old photographs, hunting trophies, and what looked like ceremonial objects. Drums, feathers, stones carved with symbols I didn't recognize. Henry gestured to a chair at a small wooden table and poured 2 cups of coffee from a battered pot. "Your grandfather came to see me in 1944. Henry began, settling into his own chair. "Right after those 5 men disappeared on Vermilion Lake. He didn't believe in the old stories at first, thought they were just superstition. But after he went down into the mine, after he saw what was down there, he believed. He spent the rest of his life trying to understand it, trying to find a way to stop it." "What is it, Henry? What's down there?" The old man took a long sip of his coffee, his eyes distant. "My people have many names for it. The most common one you would recognize is Wendigo. But that's not quite right. The Wendigo of legend is a spirit of hunger and winter, born from cannibalism and desperation. What lives beneath Vermilion Lake is older than that, older than the Ojibwe, older than any human tribe. It was here before the glaciers came, and it will be here long after we're gone." He stood up and walked to a wooden chest in the corner. From it, he pulled out a rolled bundle of deer hide. He spread it on the table, revealing a map drawn in faded ink and charcoal. It showed Vermilion Lake, but also what lay beneath it. A massive network of caves and tunnels, all converging on a central chamber marked with a symbol that looked like a spiral within a circle. "The earth beneath the Iron Range is full of holes, Sheriff. The mining companies never found all of them. The natural caves go down for miles, deeper than any shaft man ever dug. And in the deepest place, where the rock meets the ancient water, it lives. My grandfather called it the water that hungers. It's not water, not exactly. It's something else. Something that looks like water, moves like water, but it's alive, conscious. And every 40 years, when the winter is coldest and the ice is thickest, it wakes up and feeds. Feeds on what? People. Their warmth, their life, their souls. It pulls them down through the ice, takes them into the deep places and consumes them. Not their bodies. Those it keeps, preserves in the cold water like specimens. But their essence, their life force, that's what it really wants. And when it's fed enough, it goes back to sleep for another 40 years. I stared at the map, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It was mythology, folklore, the kind of story people told to explain things they didn't understand. But I'd seen the light beneath the ice. I'd heard the singing sound. And I'd read my grandfather's notes. "How do we stop it?" I asked. Henry shook his head. "Your grandfather asked me the same question. The truth is, I don't know if it can be stopped. It's part of the earth here, as much as the rock and the iron ore, but it can be contained, kept dormant. In 1944, your grandfather went down into the mine with 3 of my people. They found the central chamber, found the source. They performed a ceremony, used fire and iron in the old words, and they sealed it. Drove it back down into the deepest water. It worked for 40 years. But the seal is breaking. That's why it's taking people again. Then I need to go down there and reseal it. Yes, but you can't go alone. The ceremony requires 4 people, 1 for each direction. North, south, east, west. Your grandfather, he had help. You'll need help too." I thought about Mike, my deputy. Thought about Margaret from the Historical Society. Who else could I trust with something like this? Who else would even believe it? "I'll find people," I said. "But Henry, I need you to come with us. You know the ceremony. You know the words." He was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup. Finally, he nodded. I'm 89 years old, Sheriff. My bones are old, my body weak. But yes, I'll come. This is my land as much as yours. We protect it together. We spent the next 2 hours going over the details. Henry drew me another map, this one showing the path through the mine tunnels to the central chamber. He explained the ceremony, taught me the words in Ojibwe that I'd need to speak. He gave me a leather pouch filled with tobacco, sage, and something he called ghost water, collected from a spring that never froze. When I left his cabin, the sun was fully up, though it gave no warmth. I drove straight to the station where Mike was waiting with news. They'd called off the search for Jim Kowalski. Too dangerous in these conditions and too many days had passed. Carol Kowalski was devastated. The whole town was on edge. I pulled Mike into my office and closed the door. For the next hour, I told him everything. About my grandfather's investigation, about the 40-year cycle, about what Henry Whitefeather had said. I expected him to think I'd lost my mind. Instead, he listened carefully, his expression growing more serious with every word. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My grandmother was Ojibwe. She used to tell me stories about things that lived in the deep places. I never believed them, thought they were just fairy tales. But I believe you, Tom, and I'll go down there with you." "Thank you, Mike. Who else do we need?" I thought about it. We need Margaret. She knows the mine better than anyone. And we need one more person. Someone strong. Someone who won't panic. "What about Erickson?" Mike suggested. Big Eric from the fire department. He used to work in the mines back in the 50s. He knows what it's like underground. Eric Erickson was 62 years old, 6'4", and built like a bear. He was the fire chief in Tower, a man everyone respected. If anyone could handle what we were about to face, it was him. I called him at the fire station and asked him to come to my office. He arrived 20 minutes later, snow dusting his shoulders. I went through the whole story again. Eric listened without interrupting, his broad face expressionless. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and nodded. "I believe you," he said simply. I worked level 27 back in 58. We found things down there that weren't in any geology book. Strange formations, water that glowed in the dark. The old-timers told us not to ask questions, just do our work and get out. I always wondered what they were hiding. Now I know. When do we go? "Tomorrow morning," I said. "We need today to prepare." The rest of that day was a blur of activity. Margaret closed the Historical Society and gathered the equipment we'd need. Flashlights, rope, first aid supplies, and most importantly, the keys to the mine. Mike checked our weapons, made sure we had ammunition, though I wasn't sure bullets would do any good against what we were facing. Eric assembled thermal blankets, flares, and an old mining pick that had belonged to his father. That evening, I went home to my wife Susan. We'd been married 23 years, raised 2 daughters who were now away at college. Susan was a school teacher, practical and level-headed. I'd never kept anything from her in all our years together, but this was different. How do you tell someone you love that you're about to descend into the earth to face something that shouldn't exist? I tried, sitting at our Kit James table, drinking the coffee she'd made. I told her where I was going and why. She listened, her face growing pale, but she didn't interrupt. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Come back to me, Tom Morrison," she said, her voice steady. "Whatever's down there, you face it and you come back. You understand?" "I understand." She stood up and walked to our bedroom. When she came back, she was holding something I hadn't seen in years. My grandfather's sheriff's badge, the one he'd worn for 30 years. She'd kept it in her jewelry box, a family heirloom. She pressed it into my hand. "He faced it," she said. "And he came back. So will you." I closed my fingers around the old badge, feeling the weight of it. 3 generations of Morrisons, 3 men who'd stood between their community and the darkness. I wouldn't be the one to break that chain. The next morning, we assembled at the mine entrance at first light. Henry Whitefeather was there, leaning on a walking stick, wrapped in blankets. Margaret had the keys. Eric carried a backpack full of supplies. Mike checked his service weapon one last time. And I carried my grandfather's badge in my pocket, along with the leather pouch Henry had given me. The temperature had dropped even further overnight, minus 43 degrees. The kind of cold that makes the air itself seem to crack. We didn't waste time talking. Margaret unlocked the entrance and we filed inside, the steel door clanging shut behind us like a tomb ceiling. The elevator ride down to level 27 felt longer this time. Maybe because I knew what we were going to find. Maybe because I knew not all of us might come back up. The elevator creaked and groaned, dropping us deeper into the earth with every passing second. When we reached the bottom and the gate opened, Henry stepped out first. He stood in the center of the chamber, eyes closed, listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. After a moment, he opened his eyes and nodded. It knows we're here. It's waiting. We followed the main tunnel to the sealed wall. Eric had brought a sledgehammer and a pry bar. He and Mike set to work on the concrete, breaking it apart piece by piece. The sound of metal on stone echoed through the tunnels, impossibly loud in the confined space. After 20 minutes, they'd created a hole large enough to crawl through. Mike shined his flashlight into the gap. The tunnel beyond was natural cave, not man-made. The walls were rough stone, glistening with moisture. The air that came out was cold, much colder than the mine itself, and it carried a smell like deep water and old ice. "I'll go first," I said. "No," Eric replied. "I'm bigger. If something's in there, I can handle it." "You're right behind me." He crawled through the hole, his flashlight beam disappearing into the darkness. We heard his boots on stone, then his voice echoing back. "It's clear. Come on through." One by one, we crawled through. Margaret went last, pulling our supplies behind her. On the other side, we found ourselves in a natural cave system. The ceiling was low, forcing us to crouch. Water dripped from stalactites, the sound echoing eerily. Our flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing a tunnel that sloped downward into the earth. "Stay close," Henry said, moving to the front of our group. "The path is treacherous." We walked for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes. The tunnel twisted and turned, sometimes so narrow we had to turn sideways to pass through. The air grew colder with every step, and the smell of deep water grew stronger. I could hear it now, a distant sound like waves lapping against stone. Impossible, since we were deep underground, but I heard it nonetheless. Then the tunnel opened up. We emerged into a cavern so vast our flashlight beams couldn't find the far wall. The ceiling disappeared into darkness overhead, and in the center of the cavern was water, an underground lake, its surface perfectly still, reflecting our lights like black glass. But it was the color that stopped us cold. The water wasn't black or blue. It was that same yellow-green we'd seen beneath the ice on Vermilion Lake. And it was glowing, pulsing with a sickly light that seemed to come from deep below the surface. "This is it," Henry whispered. "The source." We approached the edge of the lake carefully. The stone shore was smooth, worn down by centuries of water. As we got closer, I could see things beneath the surface. Shapes. At first I thought they were rocks or formations, but then I realized what they were. Bodies. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, suspended in the glowing water like specimens in formaldehyde. Some were recent, their features still recognizable. Others were ancient, nothing but skeletons. And there, near the front, I saw Jim Kowalski. His eyes were open, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. He wasn't decomposing. The water was preserving him, keeping him exactly as he'd been the moment he died. "Dear God," Margaret breathed. The water began to move. Not waves, but something underneath it, something massive stirring in the depths. The glow intensified and the temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath now, great clouds of it. Ice was forming on the edge of the lake, creeping toward us across the stone. "We need to start the ceremony," Henry said urgently. "Now." He positioned us at 4 points around a section of the shore. North, south, east, west, Eric to the north, Margaret to the east, Mike to the south, me to the west. Henry stood in the center, pulling items from his pack. A small drum, a bundle of sage, a container of what he called sacred fire. He lit the sage, and smoke filled the cavern. Then he began to chant, his voice rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to resonate with the stone itself. He told us when to speak, taught us the words. They were in Ojibwe, sounds I'd never made before. But somehow my tongue knew them, like they were written in my blood, passed down from my grandfather. The water reacted. It began to churn, great bubbles rising from the depths. The bodies suspended in it started to move, spinning slowly in the current. And then something rose from the center of the lake. It wasn't the Wendigo of legend, wasn't any creature I could describe. It was water, but it held a shape, a vaguely human form made of that glowing yellow-green liquid. It was massive, at least 20 feet tall, and where it should have had a face there was just darkness, empty and hungry. It spoke, not with words, but directly into our minds. I heard its voice, ancient and cold. "Why do you disturb my sleep? Why do you deny me my feeding?" We continued the ceremony, our voices growing stronger. Henry threw tobacco into the water, then the ghost water from his pouch. He sprinkled iron filings he'd taken from the mine floor, speaking words of binding and containment. The creature screamed, a sound that wasn't sound, that bypassed our ears and went straight to our souls. I felt it trying to pull me forward, to drag me into the water. Beside me, Margaret stumbled, nearly falling. Eric grabbed her, held her steady. "The circle must not break," Henry shouted. "Keep speaking. Don't stop." We didn't. We spoke the words, over and over, a litany of binding. The creature thrashed, sending great waves of water crashing against the shore. Some of the preserved bodies were thrown onto the stone, including Jim Kowalski. His body hit the ground beside me, still frozen in that expression of terror. Then Henry pulled out a knife. Before I could stop him, he cut his palm, letting blood drip into the water. "This is the old bargain," he said. "Blood for binding. One life freely given to contain the hunger." "No," I shouted, but he shook his head. "Not my life, Sheriff. Just my blood, the willingness to sacrifice. That's what it needs to accept the binding." He looked at me meaningfully, and I understood. I pulled out my own knife and cut my palm. The pain was sharp, but I ignored it, letting my blood mix with Henry's in the water. Eric and Mike did the same, and finally Margaret, her hand shaking. Our blood hit the glowing water and something changed. The creature's form wavered, began to collapse. It sank back down into the depths, its scream fading to a whisper. The glow dimmed, growing fainter and fainter until the water was just water, black and still. The ceremony was over. We stood there for a long moment, none of us quite believing it was done. Henry collapsed and Eric caught him before he hit the ground. The old man was breathing hard, his face gray with exhaustion, but he was alive. "It's done," he whispered. "Bound for another 40 years. Maybe longer, if we did it right." We gathered up Jim Kowalski's body and the 4 others that had been thrown onto the shore. It took 2 trips to carry them all back through the tunnels, up the elevator, out into the bitter cold of the February morning. It was past noon when we finally emerged, the sun high but giving no warmth. The state police helped us with the bodies. We told them we'd found them in an old mine shaft, that there'd been an accident. They didn't ask too many questions. In the Iron Range, people knew when not to dig too deep. Jim Kowalski's funeral was held 3 days later. The whole town turned out. Carol Kowalski cried on my shoulder, thanking me for bringing her husband home. I didn't tell her where I'd really found him. Didn't tell her what had taken him. Some truths are too heavy to share. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in my office when Betty buzzed me. "Sheriff, there's a call for you." University of Minnesota. Some kind of professor. I picked up the phone. "Sheriff Morrison? This is Dr. Scarlett James, Department of Geology. I'm calling about some unusual seismic readings we've been getting from your area. Activity beneath Vermilion Lake. We'd like to send a team up to investigate." My blood ran cold. "No," I said firmly, "that won't be necessary. Just some old mine settling. Happens all the time up here. Are you sure? These readings are quite unusual." "I'm sure, Doctor. Thank you for your concern." I hung up and stared out my window at the winter landscape. The ice on Vermilion Lake was solid, would be for another month at least. Beneath it, in the deep places, something slept. Something we'd bound but not destroyed. And in 40 years, maybe less, it would wake again. I pulled out my grandfather's badge, the one Susan had given me. 3 generations of Morrisons had faced this thing. In 40 years, it would be someone else's turn. My daughters were too young now, but by then, who knew? Maybe one of them would come back to the Iron Range. Maybe one of them would wear this badge. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside was everything. Henry's maps, my grandfather's notes, my own reports from the ceremony. I added one more document, a letter addressed to whoever came after me, to the next sheriff who would have to face the thing beneath the ice. And then I sealed the folder and locked it in the bottom drawer of my desk, just like my grandfather had done before me. The cycle would continue. But we'd bought 40 more years of safety, 40 more years of quiet winters and frozen lakes, 40 more years before someone else would have to descend into the darkness. Outside, the wind howled across the Iron Range, and somewhere deep beneath the frozen earth, in water that hungered, something ancient dreamed of waking. February 2024. 40 years to the day since I stood in that underground cavern and watched something impossible rise from the water. I'm 72 years old now, retired from the sheriff's department for 8 years, living in the same house where I raised my family. My hands shake sometimes, arthritis mostly, but also the weight of memory. Some things you carry forever. My daughter Emma is the sheriff now, Sheriff Emma Morrison. 3rd generation, though technically 4th if you count my great-grandfather. She's 45, tough as nails, smarter than I ever was. She didn't want the job at first. Moved away after college, worked as a detective in Minneapolis, built a whole life away from the Iron Range. But something pulled her back. Maybe it's in the blood. Maybe the land itself calls to us. She's been sheriff for 3 years, and until this week, I thought maybe the cycle had ended, that what we did in 1984 had worked permanently. Henry Whitefeather died 12 years ago, at the age of 97. Eric Erickson passed away in 2009. Mike Carlson retired to Florida, chasing warmth. Margaret Sanderson is in a nursing home in Duluth, her mind mostly gone. I'm the last one left who remembers, the last one who knows what's sleeping beneath Vermilion Lake, or what was sleeping. Emma came to my house at 6 in the morning, before sunrise. I was already awake, sitting at my Kit James table with coffee getting cold in front of me. I'd been having dreams for the past week. Bad ones. The kind where you wake up gasping, not sure what's real. I knew something was wrong before she knocked on my door. "Dad," she said when I let her in, "we need to talk." She looked tired. More than tired. Haunted. The same look I'd seen in my own mirror 40 years ago. She sat down across from me and pulled out a folder. Inside were incident reports, photographs, and something that made my blood freeze. A map of Vermilion Lake with 6 points marked in red. 3 days ago, a college student from the University of Minnesota went missing. Emma began. Jessica Hartley, 22 years old. She was staying at a cabin on the lake with friends. They were ice fishing. She went out onto the ice to check her line and never came back. We found her fishing hole still open, her gear beside it, but no sign of Jessica. My throat went dry. Go on. Yesterday, a local man, Robert James, disappeared. Same thing, he was ice fishing, his stuff was there, he wasn't. Then this morning, a woman named Scarlett Blackwood called us. Her teenage son went out before dawn to check his traps and hasn't returned. Dad, I know the official explanation is that people fall through the ice, that the lake is dangerous, but something feels wrong. And then I found this. She pulled out an old leather-bound book. My grandfather's journal. I'd given it to her when she became sheriff, told her it was family history. I'd never told her what was in it. Never told her about 1984. How do you tell your daughter that monsters are real? I've been reading it, Emma said quietly. All of it. The entries from 1944, his notes about the 40-year cycle. And Dad, I found your notes too, from 1984. I found everything you locked in the desk drawer at the station. I closed my eyes. I'd thought those files were secure. Thought I'd taken them home, but memories fade, and apparently I'd missed something. Is it true? Emma asked. All of it? The thing in the lake, the ceremony, the binding? I opened my eyes and looked at my daughter. She deserved the truth. Every word of it is true. For the next 2 hours, I told her everything. Emma listened without interrupting, her cop face on, taking it all in. When I finished, she sat back in her chair, processing. So every 40 years, this thing wakes up and takes people. And you and grandfather and his father before him, you've all faced it. You've all done this ceremony to put it back to sleep. Yes. And now, it's my turn, yes. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading. What if the binding didn't work this time? What if it's gotten stronger? I'd thought about that over the years. Worried about it during sleepless nights. Henry had told me the binding would last 40 years, maybe longer. But what if it was shorter? What if each cycle, the entity grew more powerful, harder to contain? Then we're in trouble, I said honestly. When we did the ceremony in '84, it nearly broke through. It took everything we had to push it back. If it's stronger now, we'll need help, Emma finished. More people. Better preparation. She stood up and started pacing, her mind working. I can't exactly tell my deputies that we're going to fight an ancient water monster. They'll think I've lost my mind. So who can we trust? I thought about it. Mike's in Florida. Even if we could get him back here, he's 73, has a bad heart. Eric's dead. Henry's dead. Margaret's not capable. We needed new people, but finding them would be difficult. There's someone, I said slowly. A professor at the University of Minnesota, Dr. Scarlett James. She called me back in '84, said she was detecting strange seismic activity under the lake. I brushed her off, but she's still there. I looked her up. She's head of the geology department now. If anyone has scientific data about what's happening, it's her. You want to bring in a scientist? Emma asked skeptically. We need all the help we can get, and maybe science can tell us something the old stories can't." Emma nodded. "Okay, I'll reach out to her. But Dad, we need to go to the lake. I need to see it for myself." We drove out to Vermilion Lake that afternoon. The temperature was -28, not as brutal as 1984, but still dangerous. Emma parked at the public access and we walked out onto the ice. She led me to where Jessica Hartley had disappeared. The fishing hole was still there, frozen over with a thin layer of ice. I knelt down beside it and brushed away the snow. And there it was. That yellow-green glow, faint but visible beneath the ice, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. "Oh God," Emma whispered. "It's real. It's actually real." I stood up, my old knees creaking. We need to check the other locations, where the other people disappeared. We spent the next hour visiting each site. Robert James's spot. The place where Scarlett Blackwood's son had been. Every location had the same glow beneath the ice, and when I mapped them in my head, I realized they formed a pattern. Not a circle this time, but a spiral. 6 points, spiraling inward toward the center of the lake. "It's changing," I said. "The pattern's different from before. What does that mean?" "I don't know, but it's not good." That evening, Emma made contact with Dr. James. To my surprise, the professor agreed to drive up immediately. She arrived at Emma's office at 9 p.m., a small Chinese-American woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and an urgent manner. "Sheriff Morrison," she said, shaking Emma's hand. "And you must be Thomas Morrison. I called you 40 years ago." "I remember," I said. She opened her laptop and showed us data, seismic readings, temperature anomalies, magnetic field disruptions, all centered on Vermilion Lake, all intensifying over the past week. "I've been monitoring this location for 40 years, Dr. James said. "Ever since you hung up on me. I knew something was there, something unusual. The readings come in cycles. They spike, they fade, they spike again. The current spike is the strongest I've ever recorded. Whatever is generating this energy, it's becoming more active." Emma and I exchanged glances. I told Dr. James everything, every detail of the 1984 ceremony, Henry's teachings, the entity in the underground lake. She listened carefully, occasionally taking notes. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "From a scientific perspective, what you're describing sounds like some form of subterranean organism, possibly something that exists in a state we don't fully understand. There are precedents. Deep-sea creatures that live in extreme conditions, bacteria that survive in geothermal vents. But something this large, this intelligent, that would be unprecedented." "Can you help us?" Emma asked. "I'm a scientist," Dr. James replied. "I don't know anything about ceremonies or rituals, but I can provide data. I can tell you when it's most active, when it's vulnerable. And I have equipment that might be useful. Ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging, acoustic sensors. If we're going into that mine, we should know what we're walking into." Emma stood up. "Then we're doing this. Tomorrow morning we go down. We'll need more people," I said. "The ceremony requires 4. North, south, east, west." "I have someone in mind," Emma said. "Officer David Whitefeather. He's one of my deputies, Henry's great-grandson." I felt a chill run through me. Henry's descendant. That felt right. Like the circle was completing itself. The next morning, we assembled at the Sudan mine. Emma, Dr. James, Officer David Whitefeather, and me. David was 32, tall and serious, with his great-grandfather's eyes. When Emma told him why we needed him, he didn't hesitate. "The stories are true, then," he said simply. "My great-grandfather told me, but I thought they were just legends." "They're real," I said. "All of them." Margaret had given Emma the keys to the mine before her memory faded completely. We unlocked the entrance and descended into the earth. Dr. James had brought portable lights, making the journey down to level 27 easier than it had been 40 years ago. But the weight of the rock above us, the darkness closing in, that was the same. The sealed wall was still there. We broke through it again, the concrete crumbling under our tools. The passage beyond was just as I remembered, cold, dark, smelling of deep water and stone. We followed the tunnel to the cavern. When we emerged into that vast space, Dr. James gasped. She immediately set up her equipment, sensors and cameras, recording everything. The underground lake was there, but it looked different. The water level was higher than before, lapping against the stone shore, and the glow was brighter, more intense. I could see shapes moving beneath the surface. Not just preserved bodies this time, but something else. Something alive. "It's more active," I said. "Much more active than in 84. David unpacked the ceremonial items he'd brought. Sage, tobacco, sacred fire, just like his great-grandfather had used. But he'd also brought something else. A drum, old and worn, with strange symbols painted on its surface. "This belonged to him," David said. "He left instructions. Said if the binding ever failed, if the entity grew too strong, we'd need this. It's a spirit drum, used in the most powerful ceremonies." Emma looked at me. "Dad, you remember the words?" "I remember." We took our positions. North, south, east, west. Emma to the north, Dr. James to the east, David to the south, me to the west. It should have felt right, but something was wrong. I could feel it. The air was too heavy, the water too active. David began the ceremony, beating the spirit drum in a slow rhythm. We chanted the words, the same ones Henry had taught me 40 years ago. The water responded immediately, churning and bubbling. But this time, when the entity rose, it was different. It was bigger, much bigger, and it wasn't alone. 2 forms rose from the lake, both made of that glowing yellow-green water. They towered over us, at least 30 feet tall. The main entity and something else, something that looked like it had been split off from the first. A child, maybe, or a clone. "It's reproducing," Dr. James said, her voice shaking. "It's splitting into multiples. The entities spoke into our minds, but the voice was different from before, stronger, angrier. You bound us once, twice, but each binding weakens. Each cycle we grow stronger. This time there will be no binding. This time we feed until we are satisfied. And then we spread." "Spread?" Emma shouted. "What do you mean, spread?" One of the entities gestured, and I saw it. In the water, reflected like a vision. Other lakes. Other bodies of water across Minnesota, across the country, across the world. All connected through underground aquifers and caves. All potential homes for these things. They wanted to spread, to infect other water sources, to create more of themselves. David beat the drum harder, his voice rising. The ceremony was working. I could feel it, but not fast enough. The entities were resisting, fighting back. I felt that pull again, the same one from 40 years ago, trying to drag me into the water. Emma stumbled, nearly falling. Dr. James grabbed her. "The circle holds," I shouted. "Don't break the circle." Then David did something I didn't expect. He pulled out a knife and cut his palm, just like Henry had done, but instead of letting his blood drop into the water, he pressed his bleeding hand against the spirit drum. The blood soaked into the old hide, and the drum's sound changed. Deeper, more resonant, vibrating through the stone itself. The entities screamed, not just into our minds this time, but a real sound, a shrieking that echoed through the cavern. The smaller entity collapsed first, dissolving back into the water. The larger one fought harder, thrashing and sending waves crashing against the shore. We all cut our palms, all pressed our bleeding hands to the drum, the blood of 4, freely given, just like the old ceremony, but amplified by the spirit drum, made more powerful. The entity writhed and twisted, and for a moment I thought it might break free entirely. But then David spoke new words, words I'd never heard before, ancient words that felt older than time. The entity froze. Then, slowly, it began to sink back into the water. Its form dissolved, breaking apart into streams of glowing liquid that dispersed through the lake. The light faded, growing dimmer and dimmer until it was gone completely. We stood there in the sudden silence, breathing hard. "Is it over?" Emma asked. David shook his head. "Not over, just contained. But this time the binding is stronger. My great-grandfather told me these words in case we ever needed them. They're from before the Ojibwe, from the people who lived here thousands of years ago. The original binders. This seal will hold longer. Maybe 100 years. Maybe forever." Dr. James was checking her equipment. "The seismic activity is dropping," she said. "The energy signature is fading. Whatever you just did, it worked." We gathered the bodies that had been thrown onto the shore. Jessica Hartley, Robert James, Scarlett Blackwood's son, all preserved, all recoverable. We carried them back through the tunnels, up the elevator, into the cold February morning. The families got their loved ones back. The official story was another mining accident, just like 40 years before. People accepted it because they wanted to, because the truth was too terrible to face. A week later, Emma and I sat in my Kit James drinking coffee. Dr. James had returned to the university, taking her data with her. She'd promised to keep monitoring the lake, to warn us if the energy signatures ever returned. David Whitefeather had gone back to his normal duties, but I'd seen the change in him. He understood now what his great-grandfather had carried, what we all carried. "Do you think it's really over?" Emma asked. I looked out the window at the winter landscape, at the frozen lake in the distance. "I don't know, but we did everything we could. And if it comes back, there will be someone here to face it. There always has been." Emma nodded. The Morrison legacy. Not just Morrison, Whitefeather too, and anyone else who's willing to stand between the darkness and the light. She finished her coffee and stood up. "I need to get back to the office. But Dad, thank you for telling me the truth, for being there." "I'm always here," I said. After she left, I sat alone in the quiet house. Outside, the wind howled across the Iron Range, but for the first time in 40 years, I wasn't afraid. We'd faced it, we'd won, and the next generation was ready. The cycle might continue, but so would we. The protectors, the binders, the ones who kept the darkness at bay. And somewhere deep beneath the frozen earth in water that once hungered, something slept, bound by blood and fire and ancient words, dreaming, perhaps, of waking. But not today, not for a long time. The Iron Range was safe, for now. 3 months after we sealed the entity back into the underground lake, life in Tower had returned to something resembling normal. The ice on Vermilion Lake had melted with the coming of spring, and the tourists were starting to trickle back in. Emma was busy with the usual sheriff's duties, traffic stops and petty theft, and the occasional domestic dispute. On the surface, everything looked fine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It started with the dreams. Not the same ones I'd had before, of yellow-green light and drowning in cold water. These were different. I dreamed of other places, other lakes. I saw Lake Superior churning with that familiar glow. I saw the Mississippi River running yellow-green under the light of the moon. I saw smaller lakes across Minnesota, all pulsing with the same sick light. And in every dream I heard voices, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all speaking the same words. We are waking. We are spreading. The binding is breaking. I tried to tell myself they were just nightmares, stress-induced hallucinations from an old man who'd seen too much. But then Dr. James called. It was a Tuesday morning in late May. I was sitting on my porch enjoying my coffee and watching the sunrise when my phone rang. "Sheriff Morrison, this is Scarlett James. We need to talk immediately." The urgency in her voice sent a chill through me. "What's wrong?" "I've been analyzing the data from February," she said. "The seismic readings, the energy signatures, and I've been monitoring other locations across the state." "Sheriff, I think we have a problem. A big one." "What kind of problem?" "The kind that means what happened at Vermilion Lake wasn't an isolated incident. Can you come to the university? I need to show you something." I called Emma and told her we needed to take a drive to Minneapolis. She picked me up an hour later, and we made the 4-hour drive in near silence. Both of us knew that if Dr. James was worried, we should be too. We arrived at the University of Minnesota's geology department around noon. Dr. James was waiting for us in her lab, surrounded by computer screens and printouts. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing us inside. "What I'm about to show you is disturbing. I've been monitoring seismic activity across Minnesota since February, looking for any signs that the entity at Vermilion Lake might be affecting other bodies of water. What I found is worse than I imagined." She pulled up a map of Minnesota on her computer screen. It was covered in red dots, each one marking a lake or river. There were dozens of them scattered across the entire state. Each of these red dots represents a location where I've detected the same energy signature we found at Vermilion Lake, Dr. James explained. The same seismic patterns, the same temperature anomalies, the same magnetic field disruptions. They're all active, all waking up. I felt the floor drop out from under me. "That's impossible. We sealed it. We did the ceremony." "You sealed the one at Vermilion Lake," Dr. James said. "But Sheriff, I don't think there's just one entity. I think there are many. Maybe dozens, maybe hundreds, all connected through the underground water systems, and they're all waking up at the same time." Emma was staring at the map, her face pale. "How long do we have?" Dr. James pulled up another screen, this one showing a graph of energy readings over time. "Based on the rate of increase, I estimate we have 6 months, maybe less. By next February, they'll all be fully active. And if what you told me about them wanting to spread is true, then we're looking at a catastrophic event. We need to warn people," Emma said. "We need to evacuate the areas around these lakes." "And tell them what?" Dr. James asked. "That ancient water monsters are waking up and they need to leave their homes? They'll think we're insane. We need proof. Hard, scientific proof that even the most skeptical person can't deny." "Can you get that proof?" I asked. She nodded. "I have a team of graduate students. We can deploy sensors at multiple locations, collect real-time data, maybe even capture visual evidence. But it's going to take time. And resources. This isn't something the geology department can handle alone. We need federal involvement. FEMA, maybe the military." Emma pulled out her phone. "I have contacts at the FBI. People I worked with in Minneapolis. Let me make some calls." Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly. Emma's FBI contacts were skeptical at first, but Dr. James's data was compelling enough that they agreed to investigate. A task force was assembled, scientists and federal agents, all sworn to secrecy. The official story was a geological survey, looking for potential earthquake risks. The real goal was to document the entities and figure out how to stop them. I wasn't part of the task force. Too old, they said. though I think they were being polite. But Emma kept me informed. She told me about the sensors they were deploying, the data they were collecting. And she told me about the incidents. Small things at first. A fisherman on Lake Mille-Lacs reporting strange lights beneath his boat. A family swimming in Lake Minnetonka suddenly pulling their children out of the water saying something had touched them. A water skier on Gull Lake disappearing for 10 minutes, only to reappear disoriented and unable to remember what happened. The entities were testing, reaching out, learning. And then in August, someone disappeared. A teenage girl named Melissa Garcia, swimming with friends in Lake Pepin on the Mississippi River. She dove underwater and never came back up. Her body was found 3 days later, perfectly preserved, floating in the middle of the lake. The coroner said there was no water in her lungs. She hadn't drowned. Something had taken her life force, just like the victims at Vermilion Lake. The task force went into overdrive. They needed a solution, and they needed it fast. The problem was the ceremony we'd used at Vermilion Lake required specific conditions. A sealed underground chamber. Sacred items. 4 people willing to perform the ritual. We couldn't do that at dozens of locations simultaneously. That's when David Whitefeather had an idea. He came to my house one evening in early September, carrying a large bundle wrapped in cloth. "Sheriff Morrison," he said, "I've been talking with the elders in our community. Not just Ojibwe, but Dakota, Ho-Chunk, all the tribes that have lived on this land. They all have stories about the water spirits. Different names, different rituals, but the same basic entity." He unwrapped the bundle, revealing several items. A collection of spirit drums, ceremonial pipes, bundles of sage and tobacco. And something else, a large crystal that seemed to glow with an inner light. The elders believed that if we can perform a coordinated ceremony, all the tribes together, at multiple locations at the same time, we might be able to create a network, a web of binding that covers the entire state. It's never been done before, but in theory it could work. "How many people would we need?" I asked. David did some quick math. "At least 4 people per location, and we have 32 confirmed active sites. That's 128 people. And they all need to be trained in the ceremony. They all need to understand what they're facing." It seemed impossible. But what choice did we have? Emma took charge of the logistics. With FBI backing, she assembled the team. Native elders from across Minnesota. Scientists from the university. Law enforcement officers who were willing to believe. Even some military personnel who'd been read into the program. She trained them, taught them the words of the ceremony, showed them how to recognize the entities. The date was set for February 14th, 2025. Exactly 1 year after we'd sealed the entity at Vermilion Lake. It would be the coldest part of winter, when the entities were at their strongest. But it was also when they were most vulnerable to the binding. The plan was simple in concept, impossibly complex in execution. At exactly noon on February 14th, teams would position themselves at all 32 locations simultaneously. They would perform the ceremony in unison, speaking the same words, burning the same sacred materials, offering the same blood sacrifice. And if it worked, the combined power of all those ceremonies, all that focused intention, would create a network of binding strong enough to contain all the entities at once. If it didn't work, well, we'd have a lot of dead people and a state overrun with ancient water monsters. The weeks leading up to the ceremony were tense. More people disappeared. 5 in total, all recovered, preserved in the water, all dead. The media was starting to notice, asking questions about the unusual number of drownings. The task force had to work overtime to keep the real story from leaking. Emma barely slept. She was coordinating 32 teams across the state, making sure everyone had the equipment they needed, the training they required. David was traveling constantly, meeting with tribal elders, ensuring the spiritual aspects of the ceremony were correct. Dr. James was monitoring the seismic data, watching the entities grow stronger. And me? I waited, an old man with shaking hands and too many memories. I wasn't part of any team. I'd done my part 40 years ago, and again last year. This was the next generation's fight. But on February 13th, the night before the ceremony, Emma came to see me. She looked exhausted, running on coffee and determination. "Dad," she said, "I need to ask you something. Tomorrow, at Vermilion Lake, I want you to be there. I know you've retired, I know you've done enough, but I need you there. For luck, maybe. Or maybe just so I don't feel alone." I looked at my daughter, this strong woman who'd taken on a burden that should never have fallen to her. "Of course I'll be there. Wouldn't miss it for the world." The next morning, we drove out to Vermilion Lake. It was minus 35 degrees, even colder than it had been in '84. The ice was thick and solid, gleaming in the pale winter sun. 20 other vehicles were already there, the team Emma had assembled for this location. 32 locations, 128 people, all preparing to face the impossible. We walked out onto the ice together. David was there, along with 3 other tribal elders. Dr. James was there with her equipment, ready to record everything. Mike Carlson had flown in from Florida, refusing to miss this. Even old Margaret had been brought from her nursing home, bundled in blankets in a wheelchair, her mind clear for the first time in years. At 11:55, Emma gathered everyone in a circle. "This is it," she said. "In 5 minutes we perform the ceremony. If we succeed, we save Minnesota. If we fail, well, at least we go down fighting." She looked at me, and I nodded. She was ready. They were all ready. At exactly noon, David beat the spirit drum. The sound echoed across the frozen lake, impossibly loud. We began to chant, speaking the ancient words, and as we chanted, I felt it. A connection forming, not just with the people around me, but with all the other teams across the state. 128 voices speaking as one, 128 hearts beating in unison. The ice beneath us began to glow, that yellow-green light pulsing in time with our words. The entity was rising, responding to our call, but this time it wasn't just one entity. I could feel them all, dozens of consciousnesses, all connected, all aware. They tried to resist, tried to break free. But the network held. The web of binding spread across the state, linking all the ceremonies together. I saw it in my mind's eye, a glowing net of light covering Minnesota, each node anchored by a team of people speaking words older than civilization. The entities screamed, a sound that wasn't sound, that bypassed the ears and went straight to the soul. Some people in our circle stumbled, nearly breaking the formation. But Emma held firm, her voice never wavering. And slowly, inexorably, the entities began to sink back down. The light faded. The screaming stopped. And suddenly it was over. Dr. James checked her equipment, her hands shaking. "The seismic activity is dropping. All locations. All of them." The network worked. Around us, people were crying, laughing, hugging each other. Emma pulled me into a tight embrace. "We did it, Dad. We actually did it." "For now," I said quietly. "For now." In the days that followed, the task force monitored the entities carefully. The binding held. All 32 locations showed reduced activity, the energy signatures dropping to levels even lower than before the cycle began. Whatever we'd done, it had worked better than anyone expected. The official story was that the string of drownings had been caused by unusually thin ice due to warm currents. The public bought it because they wanted to, because the truth was too strange, too frightening. The task force was disbanded. The scientists returned to their universities. The tribal elders went home. Life returned to normal. Or as normal as it could be after you'd just saved the state from ancient water monsters. But Dr. James kept monitoring. And 6 months later, in August 2025, she called me again. "Sheriff Morrison," she said, "I found something you need to know. What is it?" The entities. The network we created. It didn't just bind them. It seems to have connected them in a new way. They're communicating now, coordinating. And Sheriff, I've been seeing similar energy signatures in other states. Wisconsin, Michigan, Ontario. Whatever we bound in Minnesota, it's part of something larger. Something global. I closed my eyes. Of course it was. It always was. "What do we do?" I asked. "What we've always done," she replied. "We watch. We wait. And when the time comes, we fight." I hung up and looked out my window. Summer in Minnesota. The lakes sparkling in the sunshine. Families swimming and boating, unaware of what lurked beneath. Unaware of the ancient things that slept in the deep places, dreaming of waking. Emma came by that evening. I told her what Dr. James had said. She listened, nodding slowly. "So it's not over," she said. "It's never over. But we bought time. Maybe years, maybe decades. And we built a network. People who know the truth, who are ready to fight. When it comes back, and it will come back, we won't be alone." She smiled. The Morrison legacy continues. 4th generation now, and Whitefeather, and James, and everyone who stood with us. We're not just a family anymore. We're a movement. Later that night, I sat in my study, writing this account. Everything that happened. Everything I remember. From my grandfather's first encounter in 1944, to my own in 1984, to Emma's in 2024. 3 generations, 3 battles, 3 temporary victories. And now, as I write these final words, I think about the future, about whoever will read this, whether it's in 40 years or 400, about whoever will face the entities when they wake again. To that person, I say this: you're not alone. You're part of something larger, a chain of protectors that stretches back to the first people who walked this land. We've faced this darkness before, and we've always prevailed. Not because we're strong, but because we refuse to give up. Because we stand together. The entities will wake again. They always do. But so will we, and we'll be ready. The Iron Range is quiet tonight. The lakes are calm. The stars are bright overhead. And somewhere, deep beneath the frozen earth, in water that hungers, ancient things sleep, dreaming of the day they'll wake. But we'll be ready. We're always ready. And the watch continues. December 2025. Emma Morrison sits in her office looking at a map of North America. Red dots cover it, hundreds of them now. Dr. James's latest report is open on her computer. The entities are waking up across the entire continent. Canada, Mexico, maybe beyond. Her phone rings. It's an unknown number. "Sheriff Morrison," a voice says. "My name is Captain James Harrison, U.S. Northern Command. We've been monitoring the situation in Minnesota. Your task force, the ceremony you performed. We need your help. This is bigger than one state now." Emma closes her eyes, thinking of her father, of her grandfather, of all the Morrisons who came before. Then she opens them, her voice steady. "Tell me what you need." The watch continues. It always continues. And somewhere in the deep places of the earth, in water that hungers, something ancient stirs, not waking yet, not quite, but soon, very soon.